Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the second chapter of the second book of Kings. Herein we read of the transfer of prophetic authority from two similarly sounding named prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And Elijah is the main human protagonist of the first book of Kings. He burst onto the scene in the 17th chapter where he pronounces a 3-year famine or drought, which affects the land. And then at the time he was prophesying, Israel, the northern king, was under the control of Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel was his foreign-born wife, who was a worshiper of Baal and employed prophets in her court to displace the true religion of Israel. And Elijah confronts these prophets with a test, a challenge in the 18th chapter, where he tells them to call on their gods to pour out fire from the earth to burn them, and they spend all day working up a frenzy, and he mocks them, saying perhaps he is asleep, and then he summons Yahweh to send the fire down, and his divinity is confirmed, and his prophetic authority is validated. And then he slays the prophets of Baal, which pronounces a death sentence from Jezebel, who is determined to hunt him. That's when Elijah has his moment of doubt and despair. He prays for death, but he's given the strength to continue. And in the 19th chapter, we meet Elijah. He is his prophetic underling, and he's going to replace him in this chapter. So the opening verse reads, "And it came to pass, when Yahweh was taken up, Elijah to the heavens by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal." Now, Elijah is one of the two humans to have the distinction of not ever dying. The other one is Enoch. We read in Genesis 5:24 that he was translated into the heavens without dying, and that is a sign of righteousness, to be called up to heaven before your time and departs. And this leads many people to speculate that the two witnesses described in End Time Witnesses in Revelation 11 will be these two men. Elijah is also the preeminent prophet of the Old Testament, so much so that he is represented with Moses at the Transfiguration, and the final written prophet, Malachi, foretells his coming, which was fulfilled in John the Baptist. Now, Elijah was not a written prophet. In other words, there's not a book which bears his name, but he is a spoken prophet and the most highly esteemed of all the prophets in Israel's history. Perhaps Isaiah has the distinction of the written prophets, but Elijah is generally or universally recognized as the preeminent prophet throughout Jewish history. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Please remain here, for Yahweh has sent me on to Bethel." And Elijah said, "As Yahweh lives, and as your soul lives, I do not leave you." And they went up to Bethel. So this is the first of 3 times that Elijah tells his prophetic underling Elijah to tarry and wait and to not go forward with him, but he's testing him to see if his mettle and resolve is determined to see him to the end, and that thus validating his status and standing as a worthy successor. And he answers appropriately, "I will not leave you." So he's sticking with him all the way till the tail end, and his end is going to come. And the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elijah and said to him, "Do you know that Yahweh is taking away your master from your head?" And he said, "I also know. Be silent." So Elijah and Elisha there was never one prophet at any given time throughout Israel's history. There are numerous, and perhaps in the New Testament we have many prophets walking the earth right now. One who recently deceased was Ken Clemente, who predicted with uncanny accuracy the rise of President Trump, and he's going to get 2 terms and revitalize our economy. Much of what he predicted we are witnessing right now. He's just an example of a recent one. So there was an entire school of prophets at this time, and they would have been multiple prophets, but Elijah is generally recognized as the prophet of Israel. That soon honor and distinction is going to pass to Elijah. And Elijah said to him, "Elijah, please remain here, so Yahweh has sent me unto Jericho." And he said, "As Yahweh lives, and as your soul lives, I do not leave you." and they came into Jericho. So for the second time, he asked him to stay behind, to not go forward, to not follow him with the end. For the second time, Elijah answers correctly and gives the righteous response, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you. There is nothing that can compel me to leave you or not stay with you to the bitter end. And Jericho was a city of some significance. They were experiencing covenantal curses, shall we say. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho came to Elijah and said to him, Do you know that Yahweh is taking away your master from over you today? And he said, I also know, be silent. So there's a repetition between the third and the fifth verse, much as the same way there is a repetition in the second and fourth one. This school of prophets is located in Jericho. Bethel was the other place, and they're asking him the question he already knows the answers to. Do you know that this day that Elijah is going to be translated into heaven and he's going to be no more? And of course he would have known this because he was the most privy one, intimately connected to him. And Elijah said to him, Please remain here, for Yahweh has sent me on to the Jordan. And he said, As Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I do not leave you. And the two of them went on. So for the third time, he asks the same question, receives the same answer. He's telling him to stay behind. He doesn't really want him to stay behind. He's testing his answer in response to see if he is truly a worthy prophet. Of course, he has no doubt in his mind, but the testing is really more of a mere formality than anything else at this point. And the Jordan River, as Joshua would part the Jordan River, we witness something similar here. And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance, while 2 of them stood by the Jordan. So there's at least 52 men in this school of prophets. There are more than one prophet at any given point at any time, both Old and New Covenant. Of course, Israel hasn't had a prophet since Malachi, but the Christian church has had plenty of them. They're not as obscure as the Hebrew Old Testament prophets, or they're much more obscure than the Hebrew Old Testament prophets, and none of them have written revelation, canonized form, but they are still prophets nonetheless. And Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water, and it was divided this way and that, so that the 2 of them passed over on dry ground. So the same miracle he had performed through Joshua on the behalf of the nation of Israel, we witnessed them walking across this Jordan River, an otherwise insurmountable barrier for men on foot. But here it's just 2 men, and they are for a specific purpose. The specific purpose is for Elijah to be translated into heaven, while the purpose for Joshua's generation was for them to come and claim the Promised Land. The Jordan River was the western extremity and border of the Promised Land, the Jordan River. And it came to pass when they passed over that Elijah said to Elijah, Ask what I am to do for you before I am taken away from you. And Elijah said, Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. So this is his final word. He's telling him his time is short, his time is imminent, it's going to come any second. If there's anything you would like from me, please let me know now, because your minute, you're not going to recover it after this point. And Elijah asked for the same power. Now, the double portion has often been erroneously interpreted as he was twice the prophet and had twice the power of the Spirit of him, but it's really a reference to the Mosaic inheritance law, according to which in Deuteronomy 21, the eldest son was allotted a double share over any second-born or younger brother. So he's asking him to accept him as his firstborn and worthy son. So he's not asking to be twice the man he was and perform twice the miracles. As measured in miracles, Elijah is, with the exception of Moses, Elijah is perhaps the greatest prophet in Hebrew history. And he said, You have made it hard to ask, yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it is yours, but if not, it is not. So it all depends and all revolves on him staying to the final end. He passed the 3 questions, the 3 similarly worded questions or requests to stay behind. He says no, but he still has to stay with the end. And of course, this is not Elijah's power to grant such a prayer. Only Yahweh can grant our prayers. So he's not using him as an intermediary. He's just letting his wish be made known to him, and he assures him that it will come to pass if he is with him to the tail end, and he's already this far, so he's not going to relent now. And he said, you have made it, 11th verse, and it came to pass, as they continued on and spoke, that see, a chariot of fire with horses of fire, which separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into the heavens. So that whirlwind, that's what we hear of in the first verse, and that is just a storm of wind which gravitates upward, and that's how he was translated into heaven. He was accompanied by a royal chariot of heaven, a chariot of fire, we read, with horses, and it separated the two of them, so the two of them would have been Elijah and Elisha. So this whirlwind comes to claim him, leaves him behind, and of course, because he had witnessed to the tail end at his final moment, he had not forsaken his tutor, and his request would be accommodated, and we witness some of the prophetic power come to pass when he's on his own, independent of his mentor. And Elijah saw it, and he cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. Then he saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own garments and tore them in two pieces. So this translation, the whirlwind, the horses which came, must have occurred in a twinkling of an eye, because by the time he cries to his father, that's how he considered him. He was a fatherly figure, a role model, a teacher, and a master. And he's no more, so he sees him no more. He sees him now, he doesn't. And in response to the dread of not being with him, he engages in ritualistic repentance, which is the tearing of one's clothes, and to signify one's mourning. And he took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. So the mantle of Elijah which had fallen on him was the double portion of the prophecy. That means the inheritance. He was going to do the same thing he did in the same power, much as a son might wield all the accumulated resources of his own father. This is his inheritance. That's what mantle means. And he goes back and crosses to the bank of the Jordan, which had been split in for their sakes and on their behalves. And he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and struck the water, and said, where is Yahweh, Elohim of Elijah? And he struck the water, and it was divided this way and that. And Elijah passed over. So already he has a dose of this power, this prophetic power to perform miracles. He raises a staff and a mantle, and he parts the water. And the answer to the question, where is Yahweh, the Elohim of Elijah, he is right here. He is the same power who is parting this river through you, for you. And so the obvious answer to that rhetorical question is he is always everywhere, above us, around us, in us, and over us. And when the sons of the prophets who were from Jericho saw him, they said, the spirit of Elijah rest on Elisha. And they had come to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. So even though the spirit in spiritual saturation is an invisible quality, it must have radiated palpably and obviously for these prophets. It takes one to know one, so a prophet is going to have the subterranean spiritual insight to recognize the power of the spirit in whom it dwells. And so these men recognize their own. They themselves are prophets. They recognize that the same spirit that had blessed Elijah in abundance was now resting fully and completely and totally on him. So they bow to the ground before him because they are in the presence of a superior prophet. They are prophets too, but he is the prophet of Israel, much as Elijah was. And they said to him, look, there are 50 strong men with your servants. Please let them go and search for your master, lest the spirit of Yahweh has taken him up and cast him on some mountain or on some valley. And he said, send no one. So some of these prophets, at least, did not have a supernatural insight. They witnessed an obvious miracle, divine in origin, and they questioned whether he had the power to bring it through if he wasn't dropped somewhere in some adjacent geographical territory or ground or surrounding. But Elijah knows better. He says, send no one, and that silences him. So he corrects the lesser prophets with less understanding than he does, because the same spirit of Elijah is upon him this now. And they question, they see the spirit in him, yet they're questioning if the spirit had dropped him en route to heaven and therefore had failed on his mission. His mission, spirit is a he, not an it. to translate him into heaven, but Elijah successfully silences their questions. But they pressed upon him till he was ashamed, and he said, Send. So they sent 50 men, and they searched for 3 days, but did not find him. So Elijah finally relents to their request. This reminds one of the prayer of the persistent widow in Luke 18, who eventually asks and jabs and yammers so much that the one whom she asked, which was an unrighteous judge, finally hears her and accommodates her request and redresses her grievance. But the request for them was to see, they had this curiosity of where he was, but they had this doubt that he was taken into heaven. They thought he was over the mountains this way, over the mountain this way. So for a 3-day period they search and come back empty-handed, and Elijah was correct the whole time. And they returned to him, for he remained in Jericho, and he said to them, Did I not say to you, do not go? So he's reminding him of his initial instruction, which was to not go. They took it upon themselves to go, and they went, and they came back empty-handed. So he's reminding him that he had warned them of this to begin with. So listen to me. I am Elijah's successor. I am the prophet now. You are prophets, lowercase p. I'm prophet, capital P. And the men of the city said to Elijah, Look, the site of this city is good, as my master sees, but the waters are spoiled, and the land barren. So Jericho was experiencing covenantal curses. So in response to apostasy and sin and waywardness, Yahweh would afflict the land with plagues and more famines and droughts. And that's what we witnessed at the beginning of Elijah's ministry, the 3-year famine. So Jericho is experiencing similar conditions. They had the site, they had the buildings, but they did not have the food. And he said, Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it. And they brought it to him. Now this bowl is going to be a visible sermon, which is the use of visual illustrations to communicate a theological point. We just want to establish that before we actually explain it. And he went out to the source of the water and threw salt in there and said, Thus said Yahweh, I have healed this water. No longer shall death or barrenness come from it. So the source of the cleansing and the source of the miracle was not the salt or Elijah's hands itself, but it was Yahweh. He says, Thus said Yahweh, so he's at his beck and call and representing him. So it was not he. He did not take credit for healing the water that was drought and barren and causing sickness, but he made it replenish and refresh and do its job of performing the agricultural output, which would have been necessary for any ancient city or civilization to survive. And the waters were healed to this day, according to the word of Elijah, which he spoke. So the word of a prophet, it is as good as gold. If they say it will come to pass, even if it has not come to pass, it will come to pass. We have to treat the words of Yahweh's prophets as we do Yahweh's himself, because most of us will never hear a tangible voice from Yahweh, but we do have the readings, the writings of his prophets in the collected canon, Genesis to Revelation, and that is to be our guiding and governing authority. And he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up the way, some youths came from the city and mocked him, and said to him, Go up, bald head, go up, bald head. So this is the course of his ministry. He is being mocked, and prophets are often mocked creatures because Elijah was described as a man who was a hairy man who wore a girdle around his waist in the 8th verse of the 1st chapter. So their appearance, their beggarly appearance often invites mocking. In Elijah's case, he was bald. Baldness was not as common in ancient Israel as it is in other historical cultures and civilizations, so it would have been considered a curse. But clearly this man was blessed spiritually, even if he wasn't 100% blessed physically. But that is a source of figure and ridicule. These youths are immature. They are below the age of 30, because youth in anyone, the Levitical Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, the mandatory minimum age was 30 years old. This was the age that Joshua and John the Baptist also ministered. And he turned around and looked at them and pronounced a curse on them in the name of Yahweh. That's actually all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Pizza came here.